What if I told you that during the First Crusade, Christian knights didn't just kill their enemies, they ate them, not out of desperation but as a message. In December 1098, at the siege of Ma'ara, starving Crusaders reportedly dug up graves, roasted human limbs, and boiled corpses in cauldrons. Was it hunger, fanaticism, or something even darker? This is the moment when faith turned into horror and history tried to bury the truth. Picture yourself in 1096, standing in a crowded field as the distant voice of Pope Urban II rings out. He calls Christians to take up arms and reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. Across Europe, this message spreads like wildfire. Tens of thousands answer, knights in chainmail, peasants clutching farming tools, even widows and children joining the march east. They sew crosses onto their clothing, believing this holy mission will secure their place in heaven. But most have no maps, no supply lines, no real military experience. They move in chaotic groups, convinced faith alone will sustain them. Food runs out within weeks. Some turn to stealing from villages along the way, sparking violent clashes with local communities. By the time they reach Hungary, winter sets in. Frostbite claims fingers and toes. Dysentery and fever spread through the ranks. Those who can't keep up are left by the roadside to die. The survivors press on toward Constantinople, where Byzantine officials watch these ragged crowds with shock. Emperor Alexios I expected disciplined soldiers, not starving masses led by preachers and madmen. He supplies them grudgingly before pushing them across the Bosphorus into hostile territory. Here, the real suffering begins. Turkish cavalry pick off stragglers. Water sources dry up in the summer heat. Horses collapse and are butchered for meat. By late 1098, after 2 years of marching and fighting, the remaining Crusaders reach Syria. Their numbers have halved. Those still standing are skeletons wrapped in tattered cloaks, plagued by hallucinations and open sores. Morale hangs by a thread. Leaders bicker over strategy as men whisper about deserting. Then comes their next target, the walled city of Ma'ara, a minor but stubborn stronghold blocking their path south. The siege begins in December. At first, the Crusaders hope for a quick surrender, but Ma'ara's defenders mock them from the walls, confident in their stored grain and deep wells. Days stretch into weeks. The Crusaders exhaust their last scraps of food. They boil leather straps and shields into a foul broth. Some gnaw on grass or tree bark. Others dig through graveyards outside the city, searching for anything edible. One chronicler describes men so desperate they chew on their own belts until their gums bleed. Disease runs rampant. Frost coats the ground each morning. The air fills with the stench of unburied corpses. Commanders order attacks, but each assault fails. Inside the city, the defenders taunt them by roasting meat over fires where the starving Crusaders can smell it. By now, the crusade has stopped being about Jerusalem or redemption. It's about surviving the next hour. When whispers spread about what happened at Antioch earlier that year, rumors of Crusaders eating fallen enemies, nobody dismissed them outright. The siege drags into its 6th week. Then, suddenly, a breach appears in Ma'ara's defenses. The Crusaders storm through, swords drawn. What happens next isn't just conquest, it's something the world isn't prepared to forget. The Crusaders arrived at Ma'ara in early December 1098, expecting another quick surrender like the smaller towns they've taken. But this Syrian city is different. Its walls stand 3 stories high, manned by well-prepared defenders who've stockpiled food and weapons. The Crusaders set up camp outside, digging trenches and assembling siege towers from nearby trees. Days pass with no progress. Archers on the walls pick off anyone who gets too close. Winter tightens its grip as December wears on. The Crusaders' initial confidence fades when their first assault fails. Scaling ladders collapse under the weight of armored men. Boiling oil pours through gaps in the siege engines. Inside Ma'ara, the defenders taunt them by cooking meals in plain view. The smell of roasted meat drifting over the walls to starving men who haven't eaten proper food in weeks. By week 3, desperation takes hold. The Crusaders slaughter their remaining horses, then turn to the pack animals. When those run out, they boil leather shields and saddle straps into a thin, bitter gruel. Chronicler Albert of Aachen records soldiers chewing grass like cattle and digging through abandoned graves outside the city for scraps of cloth or bone marrow. Some men reportedly gnaw on their own belts until their teeth break. January brings freezing rains. The camps turn to mud pits where dysentery spreads. Knights who once wore polished armor now shuffle wrapped in rags, their faces gaunt. Hallucinations begin. Men swear they see feasts materialize in the distance or hear voices promising salvation. A priest claims the Virgin Mary appeared to him, urging the troops onward. But when another religious leader suggests abandoning the siege, he's nearly stoned by the mob. Then comes the incident at the Eastern Gate. A group of starving Crusaders captures a local scout trying to slip through their lines. What happens next is recounted differently in various chronicles, but all agree on one detail: the Crusaders butchered and ate him. Some accounts say they roasted the flesh over open fires. Others claim pieces were distributed among the hungriest men. News spreads through the camp within hours. Shock gives way to silence. Nobody protests. When February arrives, the siege enters its 8th week. The defenders, running low on supplies themselves, try a nighttime breakout. It fails, but during the fighting, part of the northern wall collapses from earlier mining attempts. At dawn, the Crusaders swarm through the gap. What follows isn't the usual looting frenzy. Chroniclers describe men ignoring chests of coins and bolts of silk, instead making straight for the food stores. When they find the granaries nearly empty, something snaps. Radulf of Ken, writing years later, states simply, "In Maara, our troops boiled pagan adults in cooking pots. They impaled children on spits and devoured them grilled." Other chroniclers use phrases like unholy hunger and feasts of rage. Muslim survivor accounts tell of Crusaders cutting open the bellies of the dead, searching for swallowed gold coins, then keeping the bodies for other purposes. Even by medieval standards, the reports stand out for their graphic detail. The few commanders still coherent try to restore order, but discipline has evaporated. Some knights participate in the atrocities, others retreat to pray. By the time word reaches the Pope months later, the stories have already begun circulating across the Muslim world. Maara becomes more than a fallen city. It becomes a turning point in how both sides will remember the Crusades for centuries. As smoke rises over the ruined city, a chilling realization sets in among the surviving Crusaders. They've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. And their justification comes not from military necessity, but from something far darker. A contemporary Arab chronicler puts it plainly: they did not do this out of hunger. They did it to terrorize all who would resist them. Now, with Jerusalem still months away, they face a new problem, carrying this horror forward. The siege of Maara didn't just break the Crusaders, it changed them. Chroniclers who witnessed the aftermath struggled to describe what they saw. Radulf of Cain wrote that in Maara, Christian troops seized captured Saracens, dead or alive, and hacked them apart. Pieces of bodies roasted over fires while others boiled in pots. Fulcher of Chartres, usually reluctant to criticize fellow Crusaders, admitted some tore apart the dead like wild animals, stuffing their mouths with flesh still dripping blood. The descriptions vary in detail but agree on the horror. One account mentions Crusaders using enemy corpses as firewood when regular fuel ran out. Another describes children's bodies skewered on makeshift spits. Unlike typical starvation cannibalism, where survivors might reluctantly consume the already dead, these acts involved systematic butchery of enemy combatants and civilians. Some knights reportedly selected specific body parts, treating limbs like cuts of meat. A Muslim chronicler wrote of finding cauldrons filled with chopped joints and floating heads in abandoned Crusader camps. Was this just extreme hunger? The evidence suggests otherwise. Food stocks found in the city, while low, weren't completely exhausted. Some Crusaders had preserved rations hidden away. More telling are the reports from commanders noting how the cannibalism spread, not quietly among desperate small groups, but openly, almost defiantly. A Frankish knight told one chronicler they ate Muslims, so the infidels would know real fear. The religious dimension can't be ignored. Multiple sources quote Crusaders using Eucharistic language while consuming their enemies. Phrases like "body of the unbeliever" slipped into normally sacred sayings. One priest reported hearing men swear they made communion of pagan flesh. These weren't random acts. Chroniclers describe processions where Crusaders carried cooked human meat through ruined streets, chanting hymns between bites. Muslim accounts emphasize the performative cruelty. Ibn al-Athir, writing decades later but using survivor testimonies, claimed Crusaders would pepper the flesh so it smelled like ordinary meat, then offer it unknowingly to newly arrived troops. Another Arab historian describes invaders forcing prisoners to watch as their relatives were butchered and cooked, telling them, "Your sons will fuel our march to Jerusalem." European records try to justify it differently. Some claim the worst offenders were Taffers, a fanatical subgroup of pauper crusaders known for extreme violence. But noble knights didn't stop these acts. Multiple leaders participated. Bohemond of Taranto reportedly accepted a gift of prepared human meat from his men without objection. Modern historians still debate the numbers. Estimates range from dozens to hundreds of victims consumed, spread over several days. What's clear is that this wasn't hidden. Messengers carried news to nearby towns before the Crusaders themselves arrived. Muslim defenders at the next siege swore they'd rather burn their own city than let these men inside. The psychological impact was immediate. Crusader discipline collapsed further. Raiding parties began hunting local villagers, not just for supplies, but explicitly for meat. Normal thefts were recorded alongside chilling new entries in supply logs. Phrases like, "2 Turks, ready for roasting," appear in one knight's diary. This poses a hard question. When does starvation become something else? Survival cannibalism follows clear patterns, eating the already dead, prioritizing nutrition over cruelty. Ma'arah shattered those norms. The meticulous preparation methods, the deliberate selections of certain victims, the integration of these acts into religious practice, these choices went beyond desperation. By the time the Crusaders marched south toward Jerusalem, their reputation preceded them. Muslim armies stopped taking prisoners. Towns burned their own food stores rather than let them fall into Crusader hands. The siege of Ma'arah became a weapon against them, proof that these weren't holy warriors but something more monstrous. Back in Europe, the stories took longer to arrive. When they did, reactions split between horror and uneasy silence. Some monks, copying chronicles, quietly omitted the worst passages. Others attributed the acts to God testing his servants. Only decades later would scholars start asking what really happened that winter and what it said about the Crusades as a whole. News of the cannibalism at Ma'arah trickled into Europe slowly. When church officials finally heard full reports, their reactions showed deep unease. Some bishops condemned the acts as abominations that disgraced Christendom. Others tried to justify them, with one chronicler claiming Crusaders were forced by divine providence to consume the wicked, suggesting God had sanctioned the horror. Pope Urban II never mentioned Ma'arah in his surviving letters. His silence is telling. The same man who had called the crusade God's will now avoided its darkest chapter. Months later, he praised the Crusaders' zeal and perseverance, focusing on their capture of Jerusalem rather than the massacre. Official histories glossed over the incident. Fulcher of Chartres devoted one vague sentence to Ma'arah. After much hardship, the city fell. Raymond of Aguilas skipped it entirely. Only a few monastic chroniclers, distant from papal influence, recorded the full horror, usually buried in archives rather than shared. The church faced a dilemma: how to preserve the Crusades' holy image as news of cannibalism spread. Some clerics claimed Muslim propaganda, others blamed rogue peasants. But accounts confirmed knights and noblemen took part. Even Bishop Adamar's chaplain admitted high-ranking Crusaders joined in, calling it a trial sent by God. Muslim chroniclers seized on this hypocrisy. Ibn al-Qalanisi described Crusaders offering surrender terms while carrying dried human flesh in their pouches. Leaders displayed butchered bodies along Crusader routes, ensuring locals saw Christian mercy. In Europe, the story was carefully erased from songs and art. A Cluny Abbey manuscript shows passages about Ma'arah scraped away. Letters were destroyed, and papal registers edited. The Church's response reveals how hard it was to reconcile holy war with atrocity. Ma'arah shows the thin line between faith and fanaticism, warning of what happens when conviction turns barbaric. The horrors of Ma'arah weren't unique in siege warfare. History records desperate acts under extreme conditions. Roman legions at Jerusalem in 70 CE saw starving rebels resorting to cannibalism. During Viking raids, Norse sagas tell of warriors eating enemies when trapped by winter storms. The 1870 siege of Paris saw Parisians buying human flesh from street vendors. But most medieval armies followed grim but consistent patterns. If cannibalism occurred, it targeted the already dead and stopped once relief arrived. Ma'ara shattered these norms. Reports suggested the Crusaders still had food reserves, yet they killed prisoners and civilians, prepared the bodies methodically, and invoked religious language. Some even saved human flesh for later consumption. Forensic evidence from Ma'ara shows bones with hacking marks and bite marks on smaller bones, suggesting a gruesome ritual rather than desperate survival. Historians still debate the motivation. Was this culinary cannibalism or a psychological tactic to terrorize enemies? J. Rubenstein points out that while other starving armies ate human flesh, only at Ma'ara did knights reportedly spit roast children. Nutritionally, the act makes little sense. A single corpse yields about 32 kilograms of edible tissue, hardly enough for hundreds of Crusaders. Contemporary accounts indicate the cannibalism lasted days, even after the city's food stores were captured. Some argue siege madness, starvation, induced psychosis, pushed men to extremes. But why didn't other besieged armies do the same? Perhaps ideology mattered. Crusaders believed they fought a holy war. Consuming infidel flesh became a form of purification. Modern parallels exist. Japanese soldiers in WWII committed similar acts against Chinese POWs, driven by dominance rather than hunger. Ma'ara's legacy warns of how faith and desperation can turn even devout warriors into butchers. History's lesson, ideology, not necessity, often drives the worst atrocities. If you're finding this deep dive into the dark side of the Crusades gripping, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new historical exposé. News of the Ma'ara massacre spread rapidly through the Muslim world. Within weeks, Syrian poets described Franks who gnaw like dogs on Muslim bones. By 1100, Persian scholars had already catalogued the atrocity among Christian crimes, transforming the siege into a lasting symbol of European barbarity. Muslim chroniclers documented the horror in detail. Ibn al-Athir wrote that Crusaders cut strips of flesh from living prisoners like butchers. Al-Azimi described them filling their bellies with martyrs' flesh while singing prayers. These reports spread widely, often illustrated with images of armored Europeans feasting on human remains. While Western accounts downplayed or obscured the events, Muslim historians preserved them. Western chroniclers struggled with these accusations. Some blamed rogue elements like the Tafurs, others simply avoided the details. Even Crusader-friendly writers like Albert of Aachen conceded certain excesses at Ma'ara, though specifics were omitted. This cognitive dissonance haunted Christendom. How could Knights of the Cross become cannibals? The massacre's memory fueled Muslim resistance. Saladin's imams invoked Ma'ara in 1187 to rally troops. Later, Mongols cited it to justify their own violence against Crusader states. Even modern jihadist groups reference the event in anti-Western polemics. For centuries, Western historians either dismissed these accounts as exaggeration or blamed them on misunderstood rituals. It wasn't until the 1860s, when Charles Clermont Ganneau uncovered mass graves near Ma'ara, that the reality began to surface. Modern excavations confirm bones split for marrow and burn marks consistent with cooking. The psychological impact on Muslim communities was profound. Stories of cannibal crusaders terrified children and fueled collective memory. In Damascus, parents warned misbehaving kids with tales of Franks who ate our people. Today, the event endures in street names, memorials, and local traditions. A stark reminder of the horrors religious wars can produce. The First Crusade began as a holy mission to reclaim Jerusalem for Christendom, but the events at Ma'ara reveal how religious fervor can devolve into horror. By December 1098, Christian soldiers who prayed at Mass and carried relics were roasting human limbs and boiling corpses. Psychologically, the shift is striking. After marching thousands of miles through enemy lands, facing disease and starvation, the Crusaders arrived at Ma'ara exhausted and mentally frayed. Chroniclers noted visions, hallucinations, and demons whispering at night. Civilization's norms crumbled. The most disturbing part wasn't the cannibalism itself, but the justifications. Some claimed they purified enemies by eating them. Others saw it as vengeance. A few believed consuming Muslims would transfer their strength. All framed atrocity as piety. Modern psychology calls this moral disengagement, the same mindset that's fueled holy wars, inquisitions, and modern terror. Church authorities largely stayed silent. Some blamed extremist followers called tafirs. Even though noble knights participated, Pope Urban II ignored the massacre, focusing on Jerusalem. This silence reveals deep cognitive dissonance. How could God's warriors become monsters? Muslim chroniclers like Ibn al-Athir documented the horrors: pregnant women killed for food, flesh cooked with spices, memories that fueled centuries of resistance. Yet the lesson of Ma'ara isn't about medieval religion but human nature itself. From World War II to colonial Congo, history shows that absolute conviction can make anyone justify the unthinkable. Modern excavations have found bones cracked for marrow and cooking pots with human residues, proving this was no desperate last resort but systematic. Ma'ara's anniversary passes quietly in Syria, unmarked by monuments, while Western history often omits it. The bones at Ma'ara remind us, it's not just faith, but absolute certainty that can turn piety into atrocity. The Siege of Ma'ara stands as history's warning, a moment when faith curdled into something monstrous. These weren't barbarians, but Christian knights who had prayed before battle and carried crosses into war. Yet hunger and zeal twisted them until roasting enemies seemed justified, even holy. The Church's silence afterward speaks volumes. So does the way Muslim chroniclers never let the world forget. Some stories won't stay buried, no matter how hard we try. The bones at Ma'ara still whisper, absolute conviction can make monsters of anyone. When we claim God sanctions cruelty, we cross a line no war should cross. What are your thoughts on the Siege of Ma'ara? Share your comments below, we'd love to hear your perspective on this disturbing event.